He said no. Quitting would have made sense. Starving made sense. This isn't success. This is survival. Sylvester Stallone poverty, rejection, pain, survival, where breaking is not an option. The first thing the world gave Sylvester Stallone was a mistake. He wasn't born into a legacy. He wasn't born into comfort. On July 6, 1946, in the charity ward of a hospital in Hell's Kitchen, New York, he was born into an accident. The delivery was difficult. The doctors were impatient. In the chaos of the moment, seeking to pull the child into the world, an intern used a pair of forceps. He clamped down on the baby's head, trying to force the birth. He pulled, and in that split second of force, he severed a nerve in the infant's face. The lower left side of his face was paralyzed instantly. A section of his lip, his tongue, and his chin went numb. They would stay that way forever. When they handed him to his mother, he didn't look like the other babies. His eyelid drooped. His mouth was twisted into a permanent, involuntary snarl. He looked battered. He looked angry. He looked broken. For most of his childhood, that is exactly what the world told him he was. His name was Sylvester Gardenzio Stallone. But the name didn't matter as much as the face. In the 1940s and 50s, physical difference wasn't met with empathy. It was met with suspicion. People looked at him and saw something wrong. They saw a deformity. They saw stupidity. Because of the paralysis, he couldn't speak clearly. His words were trapped behind a tongue that wouldn't cooperate, coming out in a slur that sounded like he had a mouthful of marbles. He was the kid in the corner who looked mean, the kid who talked funny, the kid who was marked before he ever had a chance to introduce himself. His home life offered no shelter from the judgment. His parents' marriage was a war zone, loud and volatile. His father, Frank, was a hairdresser with a violent temper. His mother, Jackie, was eccentric and distant. There was no soft place to land. Sylvester spent his earliest years in boarding care, shuffled away while his parents worked and fought. He was isolated, staring out of windows, trapped inside a body that betrayed him every time he tried to speak. He learned early that if he opened his mouth, people laughed. If he just stood there with that frozen snarl, people got nervous. He began to retreat into his own mind. He wasn't just a lonely kid. He was a kid hiding from his own reflection. He would wear superhero costumes under his school clothes, Superman mostly. It wasn't just play. It was armor. If he wore the S on his chest, maybe it didn't matter that his face was frozen. Maybe he could be strong instead of broken. But the world didn't see Superman. They saw a weird kid with a crooked face in a rough neighborhood. He was barely 5 years old, and he had already learned the hardest lesson of his life. The world judges you by what it sees. And what it saw in Sylvester Stallone was a mistake. If the hospital gave him the scar, The schoolyard gave him the shame. Sylvester didn't just look different. He sounded different. And in the brutal hierarchy of childhood, difference is weakness. When he spoke, the words stumbled out, thick and slurred. He tried to tell jokes, tried to explain himself, but the punchline was always him. Other kids called him Slur. They called him Quasimodo. They mocked the way his lip didn't move when he laughed. He learned quickly that silence was safer. The bullying wasn't just verbal. He was small, skinny, and sickly, suffering from rickets that left his legs weak. He was an easy target. He would come home with bruises he couldn't explain, and tears he tried to hide. But home wasn't a sanctuary. The chaos of his parents' marriage spilled over into everything. He moved from school to school, 12 schools in total, before he graduated high school, never staying long enough to make a friend, but always staying long enough to be the new weird kid with the funny face. He began to withdraw. If the real world was going to reject him, he would build a new one. He spent hours in front of the television, lost in old movies. He saw men like Steve Reeves playing Hercules, men with muscles like armor, men who commanded respect without saying a word. He saw that strength was a language everyone understood. He began to realize that if he couldn't fix his face, maybe he could build a body that no one would dare laugh at. But that was a distant dream. In reality, he was still the skinny kid in the back of the class, wearing a superhero costume under his shirt, hoping no one would notice him, and terrified that everyone was looking. He started acting out, not because he was bad, but because he was invisible. He set fires. He got into fights he couldn't win. He was expelled again and again. Teachers wrote him off as disturbed, unteachable, destined for prison or the electric chair. One guidance counselor told him his brain was dormant. He believed them. Why wouldn't he? Every mirror told him he was broken. Every teacher told him he was stupid. Every bully told him he was worthless. He retreated further into his imagination, creating heroes who were flawed but unbreakable, men who took the hits and kept standing. He didn't know it yet, but he wasn't just hiding. He was writing the first draft of his own survival. But for now, he was just a lonely boy in a world that didn't want him, wishing he could be anyone else. By the time Sylvester hit his teens, the label was permanent: failure. School was a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He sat in classrooms where the words on the chalkboard looked like hieroglyphics, and the teachers' voices sounded like judgments. He had been diagnosed with attention issues before there was a name for them, labeled a problem child before anyone asked what the problem was. His grades were a disaster, a string of FS and DS that confirmed what everyone already suspected. He wasn't just failing, he was being discarded. His father, Frank, was not a man of patience. He looked at his son's report cards and saw laziness, He looked at his son's face and saw weakness. "You weren't born with much of a brain," Frank would tell him, casually, brutally. "So you better develop your body." It wasn't advice. It was a sentence. Sylvester was sent to a special high school for troubled youth in Philadelphia, a place that felt less like an academy and more like a holding pen. The message was clear. We don't expect you to succeed. We just expect you to stay out of trouble until you're old enough to disappear. He felt disposable, like a rough draft that had been crumpled up and tossed in the corner. He worked odd jobs, cleaning lion cages at the zoo, ushering at a movie theater, anything that kept him out of the house and out of trouble. At the theater, he would watch the same movies over and over, mouthing the lines in the dark, watching the actors on screen. They were beautiful. They were articulate. They were everything he wasn't. But in the dark, he could pretend. He could pretend he was the hero. He could pretend his voice didn't slur. He could pretend he mattered. The turning point, or what should have been the breaking point, came when he was voted most likely to end up in the electric chair by his classmates. It was meant to be a joke, a cruel high school gag. But when he read it, it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like a prophecy. He looked around at his life. His parents were divorced. His home was gone. His grades were hopeless. And his face was still paralyzed. He had no skills, no prospects, no one who believed he was worth saving. He was 18 years old, and the world had already decided his ending. But deep down, in a place the teachers and the bullies couldn't reach, a small, stubborn ember was burning. He didn't want to end up in the electric chair. He didn't want to be the punchline. He wanted to be the one telling the story. He started lifting weights in a serious way, taking his father's cruel advice and turning it into armor. He started writing bad poetry, messy stories, anything to get the noise out of his head. And he started to dream of something impossible. Acting. It was laughable. A kid with a paralyzed face and a speech impediment wanted to be an actor. It was the kind of dream you didn't say out loud, because even you knew how ridiculous it sounded. But it was the only thing that made him feel like he wasn't disposable. So he held on to it, not because he thought he would succeed, but because it was the only thing keeping him from accepting the prophecy. He wasn't ready to disappear. Not yet. There's a special kind of humiliation in wanting something you're told you can never have. For Sylvester Stallone, acting wasn't just a dream. It was a lifeline. But every time he reached for it, the world slapped his hand away. He was in his early 20s, drifting through Philadelphia and New York, working dead-end jobs, sleeping in rooms that smelled of mildew and regret. He'd stand in front of the mirror, practicing lines from movies, trying to force his mouth to move the way other actors' mouths moved. He'd watch his reflection, see the twisted lip, hear the slurred words, and feel the old shame rise up in his chest. He wanted to be an actor, didn't look like an actor. He didn't sound like an actor. He didn't have the right face, the right voice, the right anything. He was the guy you cast as a mugger, a thug, a body in the background. Never the lead, never the hero. He tried anyway. He enrolled in drama classes at the University of Miami, hoping that training would make up for what nature had taken away. But the professors looked at him with pity, not promise. He auditioned for every play, every student film, every commercial. He was rejected so often that he stopped counting. Sometimes they didn't even let him finish his lines. Sometimes they just shook their heads and said, "Next." He moved to New York, the city of 1,000,000 actors and 1,000,000,000 broken dreams. He went to open calls, waiting in lines that snaked around the block, surrounded by men with perfect teeth and perfect diction. He'd get his 30 seconds in front of a casting director, and it was always the same. The flinch, the awkward silence, the polite dismissal. "Thank you. We'll let you know." They never did. He tried to get an agent. He walked into offices with his headshot and resume. And most of the time, the receptionist wouldn't even look up. When he did get a meeting, the agent would glance at his photo, listen to him speak, and say, "You're not right for this business. Maybe try something else." Something else. That was the refrain. Drive a truck, work construction, give up. But Stallone couldn't give up. He started writing scripts, not because he thought he was a writer, but because no one would cast him in anything worth doing. He wrote stories about losers, about men who were broken, but still fighting. He wrote late at night, in tiny apartments, by the light of a single bulb, pounding away on a typewriter he'd found in the trash. The scripts were rejected, too. Too dark, too weird. Who's going to play this guy? The answer was always the same: me. I'm going to play him. He kept going. He kept showing up. He kept getting doors slammed in his face. He started to wonder if he was crazy. If maybe everyone else was right. If maybe he was just a deluded kid with a broken face and a broken dream. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't let go of the idea that he could matter, that he could be more than the sum of his scars. He looked in the mirror and practiced over and over, trying to make his mouth work, trying to make his voice clear. He put marbles in his mouth, like Demosthenes, hoping to train his tongue. It didn't work. The slur stayed. The snarl stayed. He was an actor with no credibility, a writer with no audience, a man with a dream that looked a lot like a delusion. But he kept showing up, day after day, rejection after rejection. This was the moment where everything could have ended quietly. But Stallone refused to disappear. He was waiting for the world to blink. There's a kind of hunger that goes beyond the stomach. It's the ache of being invisible, the humiliation of knowing you could disappear and no one would notice. By the early 1970s, Sylvester Stallone was living in that hunger every day. He was broke. Again. The odd jobs cleaning lion cages, ushering at theaters, cutting fish, barely paid enough for a meal, let alone rent. The city was cold, and so was the world. He was evicted from his tiny apartment, his few belongings stuffed into a bag, his dreams reduced to whatever he could carry. He had nowhere to go, no family to call, no friends with a spare couch. He wandered the streets of New York, walking until his feet blistered, until the sun went down and the city turned mean. When he couldn't walk anymore, he found the Port Authority bus terminal. For 3 weeks, the bus station was his home. He slept sitting up on hard plastic benches, surrounded by the lost and the broken. He clutched his bag to his chest, afraid to close his eyes for too long. The air reeked of diesel and desperation. He watched commuters rush by people with jobs, with homes, with purpose, and felt like a ghost haunting the edges of their lives. Hunger became his constant companion. It wasn't just an empty stomach. It was a pain that gnawed at his insides, a reminder that he was losing the fight. He scavenged for food, eating leftovers off trays in diners before the busboys could clear them. He drank water to fill the emptiness. He lost weight, his face growing gaunt, his eyes hollow. He looked less like an actor and more like a derelict. The humiliation was total. He washed in public restrooms, scrubbing his armpits with paper towels, trying to hold onto a shred of dignity. He shaved with a dull razor in a cracked mirror, staring at his own reflection and wondering how it had come to this. One night, freezing in the terminal, he saw a casting notice for a softcore pornography film called The Party at Kitty and Stud S. It paid $200 for 2 days of work. It was degrading. It was shameful. It was the end of any respectable career before it had even started. He took it. He didn't take it because he wanted to. He took it because he hadn't eaten a real meal in days. He took it because the alternative was starving to death in a bus station. It was either do that movie or rob someone, he would later say, because I was at the end, the very end of my rope. For $200, he sold his pride. He spent 2 days on a dingy set, doing things that made him sick to his stomach, just to survive. When it was over, he took the cash, bought food, and got a cheap room. He had a roof over his head again, but the cost was etched into him. He felt dirty. He felt like he had crossed a line he could never uncross. He had survived, yes, but he had lost something in the process. He lay in his new, cheap bed, staring at the ceiling, the taste of shame in his mouth. He was alive. He wasn't sleeping in a bus station anymore, but he was further from his dream than ever. He wasn't an actor. He was a desperate man who would do anything to keep breathing. And the worst part, the world still didn't care. He was just another face in the crowd, another failure in a city of millions. But he was still here, and as long as he was here, he could fight. even if the only thing he had left to fight with was his refusal to die quietly. There are moments in a life when dignity is stripped away, not by a single blow, but by 1,000 small humiliations. For Sylvester Stallone, the lowest point wasn't sleeping in a bus station or taking a role he'd never mention again. It was the day he sold his dog. Butkus was more than a pet. He was Stallone's only constant, a pit bull with a battered face and a loyal heart. In a world that had turned its back, Butkus was the one living thing that didn't care about the slurred speech, the crooked mouth, the empty wallet. He was a companion in the truest sense, sharing hunger, sharing cold, sharing the long, lonely walks through the city when there was nowhere else to go. But hunger is a relentless enemy. The money from the film was gone. The rent was due. The cupboards were empty. Stallone was desperate. He tried to find work, any work, but the city was indifferent. The phone didn't ring. The auditions dried up. The world kept moving, and he was left behind. He looked at Butkus and saw the last piece of his old life, the last thing he could give up before he had nothing left. He walked to a liquor store in Hell's Kitchen, Butkus at his side, and posted a sign, "Dog for sale, $40, must love dogs." A man named Little Jimmy came by, saw the dog, and handed over the cash. Stallone watched as Butkus was led away, his tail wagging, not understanding that this was goodbye. Stallone stood on the sidewalk, the money in his hand, feeling like he had just sold his soul. He walked home alone, the silence in his apartment heavier than ever. He had done what he had to do. He had survived another day, but the cost was unbearable. He lay awake that night, haunted by the sound of Butkus's paws on the floor, the weight of his head on the bed, the simple, unconditional love that was now gone. This was the moment where everything could have ended quietly. He could have given up. He could have disappeared. He could have let the world erase him, one small humiliation at a time. But he didn't. He kept writing. He kept auditioning. He kept showing up, even when there was nothing left to show up for. The pain became fuel. The loss became a reason to keep going. He promised himself that if he ever made it, he would find Butkus and bring him home. For now, he was just another man in a city that didn't care, a man who had lost everything but his stubborn refusal to quit. The world didn't notice. The world didn't care. But Stallone was still here. And as long as he was here, the story wasn't over. There's a point where rejection stops feeling like a message and starts feeling like your identity. For Sylvester Stallone, that point came long before anyone knew his name. He was broke. Again. He was hungry. Again. He was alone, walking the same cracked sidewalks, carrying the same battered headshots, knocking on the same doors that had already slammed in his face. He had lost count of the auditions. He had lost count of the scripts he'd mailed out, the phone calls that went nowhere, the polite no thank yous that stung more than outright insults. Hollywood didn't just reject him, it ignored him. He was invisible in a city built on faces. He was the wrong kind of different, too rough, too slurred, too raw. Casting directors didn't see a leading man. They saw a liability. They saw a risk. They saw a guy who would never sell tickets, never get the girl, never be the hero. He tried everything. He took bit parts, thug, mugger, nameless goon. He stood in the background, hoping someone would notice, hoping for a line, a look, a chance. He got nothing. He was told again and again to give up. You're not right for this business. You're not what we're looking for. Maybe try something else. He tried to write his way in. He wrote scripts about men who were broken, men who were desperate, men who looked a lot like him. He sent them everywhere. The rejections piled up. Too dark, too violent. No one wants to see this. He started to believe it. Maybe no one wanted to see him either. He watched as other actors, guys he'd auditioned with, guys he'd seen in waiting rooms, started to get roles, started to get noticed. He watched their faces on billboards, their names in lights. He felt the old shame, the old anger, the old hunger. He wondered what they had that he didn't. He wondered if he was cursed. He tried to change. He tried to soften his voice, to hide the snarl, to be what they wanted. It didn't work. The more he tried to fit in, the more he disappeared. He was too much. He was not enough. He was always wrong. The humiliation was constant. He'd walk into an audition, see the look on the casting director's face, and know it was over before he even opened his mouth. He'd leave, head down, heart pounding, wondering how much longer he could take it. He considered quitting. He considered going home. He considered disappearing. But every time he got close, something stopped him. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the simple refusal to let the world have the last word. He was rejected again and again. He was mocked, dismissed, ignored. But he kept showing up. He kept writing. He kept fighting. Because the only thing worse than being rejected was being erased. This was the moment where everything could have ended quietly. But Stallone refused to let rejection be the end of his story. He was still here, and as long as he was here, there was still a chance, no matter how small, no matter how impossible, that the world would finally see him. There's a special kind of pain in watching the world move on without you. For Stallone, it was a daily ritual standing in the shadows, watching other people's dreams come true, while his own life shrank to the size of a rented room and a stack of rejection letters. He saw it everywhere. On the subway, he'd stare at movie posters with faces he recognized from auditions. Guys who'd sat next to him in waiting rooms. Guys who'd laughed at his slurred speech. Guys who'd told him, hey, maybe next time. He'd see them on TV, in commercials, in magazine spreads. They were getting the roles, the money, the attention. They were living the life he'd risked everything for. He tried to be happy for them. He tried to tell himself it was just timing, just luck, just the way things go. But the truth was uglier. Every new success for someone else felt like a nail in the coffin of his own dream. He felt himself shrinking, becoming less real, less necessary, less alive. He started to avoid old friends. He stopped going to parties, stopped answering the phone, stopped pretending he was just between gigs. He couldn't stand the pity in their eyes, the awkward silences, the way they'd change the subject when he talked about acting. He was tired of explaining, tired of making excuses, tired of pretending he was okay. He worked odd jobs to survive, cleaning, moving furniture, anything that paid cash. He'd come home exhausted, his hands raw, his body aching, and wonder if this was all there was. He'd stare at the ceiling, listening to the city outside, and feel the weight of every missed opportunity pressing down on his chest. He watched as the world rewarded people who fit, people who were easy to like, easy to sell, easy to understand. He was none of those things. He was complicated, rough-edged, hard to place. He was the guy you crossed the street to avoid, not the guy you put on a poster. He tried to write his way out. He poured his frustration into scripts, stories about men who were invisible, men who were desperate, men who refused to quit even when quitting made sense. But the scripts went nowhere. The phone didn't ring. The world didn't care. He started to wonder if maybe he was the problem. Maybe he was too stubborn, too damaged, too different. Maybe the world was right to move on without him. This was the moment where everything could have ended quietly. He could have faded away, become another name no one remembered, another face in the crowd. But he didn't. He kept showing up, kept writing, kept fighting for a place in a world that didn't want him. Because the only thing worse than being forgotten was never having mattered at all. And Stallone, for all his pain, for all his failures, still believed, somewhere deep down, that he was meant for something more, even if the world refused to see it. Desperation is a kind of clarity. By 1975, Stallone had nothing left to lose. He was broke, alone, and invisible, a man the world had already decided to forget. The city was cold, the rent was overdue, and the phone never rang. He was living on the edge of eviction, eating cheap food, and counting coins to buy dog food for Butkus if he could find him again. He spent his days walking the streets, his nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer he could hold out. The humiliation of failure was constant. He was the guy who had sold his dog, the guy who had done porn to survive, the guy who couldn't get a call back for a 2-line part. He was the guy who didn't matter. But somewhere in that darkness, a story started to take shape. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about being the best. It was about surviving when the world tells you you're nothing. It was about a man who takes every punch and keeps getting up. It was about a loser who refuses to quit. He saw a fight on TV, Muhammad Ali versus Chuck Wepner. Wepner, the underdog, took a beating but kept standing. Something clicked. Stallone went home and started writing. He wrote for 3 days straight, barely sleeping, barely eating, pouring every ounce of pain, rejection, and humiliation into the script. He wrote about a man with a crooked face and a slurred voice, a man who was invisible until he refused to be. He called him Rocky. The script was raw, messy, and real. It was Stallone's life on the page, every failure, every humiliation, every moment where everything could have ended quietly. He wrote about poverty, about hunger, about the ache of being overlooked. He wrote about love, about hope, about the stubborn refusal to disappear. When he finished, he had something he'd never had before, a story that was his and his alone. He started shopping it around, sending it to every producer, every agent, every studio that would take his call. The rejections came fast. Too dark, too depressing. No one wants to see a loser. But one thing was different this time. They liked the script. They just didn't want him. Producers offered money, real money, more than he'd ever seen. But only if he agreed to let someone else play Rocky. Someone with a straight face, a clear voice, a name people recognized. Stallone was broke. He was hungry. He was sleeping in a room he could barely afford. But he said no. He said no to $100,000. He said no to $200,000. He said no to $350,000. He said no because Rocky was him. Because if he sold the script and let someone else play the part, he'd be erased all over again. He held out, even as the world told him he was crazy, even as the bills piled up, even as the hunger gnawed at him. He held out because this was the last thing he had, the last piece of himself the world hadn't taken. This was the moment where everything could have ended quietly. But Stallone refused to let go. He refused to disappear. He refused to let the world have the last word. He was still here, and as long as he was here, the story wasn't over. This was the moment where everything could have ended quietly. The world was offering Sylvester Stallone a way out, a way to eat, to pay rent, to stop being invisible. All he had to do was let go of the only thing that was truly his. The offers for the Rocky script kept coming. $100,000, $200,000, $350,000. Each time, the number got bigger. Each time, the condition was the same. Stallone could have the money, but he couldn't have the role. The studios wanted a real star. They wanted someone with a straight face, a clear voice, a name that would sell tickets. They wanted to buy his story, but not his survival. He was broke. He was hungry. He was living in a cheap apartment, sleeping on a mattress on the floor, counting coins for food. He had nothing left. He had already sold his dog. He had already sold his pride. The world was telling him to take the money and disappear. But he couldn't do it. He couldn't let go. He couldn't watch someone else step into the only life he'd ever wanted. He couldn't let the world erase him again. He said no, again and again. He said no to the money, no to the comfort, no to the easy way out. He said no because Rocky was him. Because if he sold the script and let someone else play the part, he'd be erased all over again. The pressure was relentless. His friends thought he was crazy. His family thought he was delusional. The producers thought he was a fool. But Stallone held on. He held on because he knew that if he let go, he'd never get another chance. He held on because he'd spent his whole life being told he didn't matter. And this was the first time he could prove them wrong. Finally, a small studio, United Artists, agreed to his terms. They would make the movie, but only if the budget was tiny, the risks were low, and Stallone took almost nothing up front. He agreed. He would have agreed to anything. He just wanted the chance to exist. He got the part. He got the chance. But the victory was not sweet. The budget was so small that he had to rewrite scenes to fit what they could afford. He had to fight for every line, every moment, every inch of dignity. He was still broke. He was still hungry. He was still terrified that it would all fall apart. But he was there. He was in the ring. He was finally being seen. This was not a triumph. It was survival. It was the cost of refusing to disappear. Stallone didn't win. He endured. And for the first time in his life, that was enough. The night before Rocky premiered, Stallone lay awake in a cheap hotel room, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of every failure, every humiliation, every moment he'd almost given up. He was about to be seen by the world, and all he could feel was terror. He had risked everything. He had said no to money, to comfort, to the easy way out. He had fought for a chance to exist, to matter, to be more than a punchline. Now, as the lights of the theater flickered on, he wondered if it had all been a mistake. The first screening was a blur. He sat in the dark, surrounded by strangers, listening for laughter, for applause, for any sign that the world would accept him. Every time the audience laughed at a line, every time they cheered, every time they cried, he felt a jolt of hope and a stab of fear. What if it wasn't real? What if it all disappeared tomorrow? The reviews started coming in. Some were kind, some were brutal, but the movie was a hit. People lined up around the block. The phone started ringing. The world, for the first time, wanted to know who Sylvester Stallone was. But hope is a dangerous thing. Stallone had spent so long being invisible, so long being told he didn't matter, that he didn't know how to trust it. He waited for the other shoe to drop. He waited for someone to tell him it was all a mistake, that he didn't belong, that he was still the same broken kid with the crooked mouth and the slurred voice. He was terrified of being seen. He was terrified of being forgotten. He was terrified of losing everything he had fought for. The money didn't come right away. The fame didn't feel real. He was still living in a small apartment, still counting coins, still wondering if he'd have to go back to sleeping in bus stations. The pressure was relentless. The fear never left. But for the first time, he had hope. For the first time, he could look in the mirror and see something other than failure. For the first time, he could believe that maybe, just maybe, he was enough. This was not a happy ending. It was a beginning, one built on terror, on doubt, on the raw, exhausting work of survival. Stallone didn't win. He endured. And for the first time, the world saw him. Fame didn't feel like victory. It felt like a test he was sure he'd fail. Almost overnight, Sylvester Stallone went from invisible to everywhere. His face was on posters, his name in headlines, his story told and retold as if it were a fairy tale. But he knew the truth. He knew what it had cost. He knew how quickly the world could turn. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted interviews. Studios wanted meetings. Strangers wanted a piece of him. He was invited to parties, to premieres, to places that had once slammed the door in his face. He smiled for the cameras, but inside, he was still the man who had slept in bus stations, the man who had sold his dog, the man who had been told over and over that he didn't belong. The pressure was relentless. Every new script, every new role, every public appearance was a chance to prove that Rocky wasn't a fluke. He was terrified of being exposed, of being found out, of being sent back to the shadows. He worked harder than ever, taking every meeting, reading every script, saying yes to everything, because he was afraid that if he said no, it would all disappear. He felt the weight of expectation in every conversation, every handshake, every glance. People looked at him differently now, but he didn't trust it. He didn't trust them. He didn't trust himself. He was still waiting for the world to blink, to remember that he was the guy with the crooked mouth and the slurred voice, the guy who didn't belong. He started to lose himself. The lines between the character and the man blurred. He was Rocky in public, but in private, he was still Sylvester, still hungry, still scared, still fighting for a place in a world that had never wanted him. He tried to hold on. He tried to remember who he was before the fame, before the pressure, before the world decided he mattered. But it was hard. The spotlight was hot, and the shadows were never far away. This was not the dream. This was survival at a higher altitude, with more eyes watching and more at stake. Stallone didn't feel like a winner. He felt like a man running out of time, running out of luck, running out of places to hide. He was famous. He was terrified, and the pressure never let up. Fame is a wave that always breaks. For Stallone, the crash came hard and public. The world that had once ignored him now turned on him with the same intensity. The roles dried up. The scripts got worse. The critics sharpened their knives. He was mocked for his voice, his face, his body, his choices. The same things that had made him an outsider now made him a punchline. He watched as the industry that had once begged for his story now rolled its eyes at every new project. Sequels, action movies, comedies that flopped, each one chipped away at the myth. He was called a has-been, a joke, a relic of a different era. The headlines were cruel. The late-night hosts were crueler. He tried to fight back. He tried to reinvent himself, to take risks, to prove he was more than a single role. But the world didn't want reinvention. It wanted him to fail. It wanted him to disappear. He felt the old shame, the old hunger, the old fear. He felt himself shrinking, becoming invisible again. The money started to run out. The offers got smaller. The rooms got colder. He was back to hustling, back to fighting for every inch, back to wondering if he'd ever matter again. He looked in the mirror and saw the same crooked mouth, the same tired eyes, the same scars. He wondered if it had all been a fluke, if he'd ever really belonged. He started to doubt himself. He started to believe the critics, the headlines, the voices that told him he was finished. He started to wonder if maybe he should have quit when it would have made sense, when it would have hurt less, when he still had something left to lose. He was mocked. He was dismissed. He was erased again and again by a world that never really wanted him in the first place. This was the moment where everything could have ended quietly. He could have faded away, become another cautionary tale, another name on a list of almosts. But he didn't. He kept showing up. He kept fighting. He kept refusing to let the world have the last word. Because for Stallone, survival was never about winning. It was about enduring. And even as the world turned away, he was still here. And as long as he was here, the story wasn't over. The body always keeps score. For Stallone, the price of survival was written in scar tissue, broken bones, and the slow, relentless ache of getting older in a business that worships youth. He had built his career on pain, on taking hits, on pushing through, on refusing to stay down. Every Rocky film, every Rambo sequel, every action role was a test of endurance. He broke ribs, tore muscles, shattered his collarbone, and kept filming. He took real punches, did his own stunts, and wore the bruises like a badge. The audience saw a hero. He felt like a crash test dummy. The injuries piled up. Surgeries became routine. His back was a roadmap of scars. His shoulders ached. His knees throbbed. He woke up every morning stiff, sore, and older than he wanted to admit. The painkillers helped until they didn't. The workouts got harder. The recovery took longer. The mirror was less forgiving. Hollywood moved on. The roles for men like him, men with battered faces and battered bodies got fewer every year. He watched younger actors take the spotlight, watched the scripts dry up, watched the world forget what it had once loved about him. He tried to keep up, tried to stay relevant, tried to prove that he could still take the hits. But the body doesn't lie. He felt the humiliation of aging in a business that only wants you when you're new. He felt the sting of being called washed up, too old, past his prime. He felt the fear that he would be remembered not for what he survived, but for how he faded away. He tried to adapt. He tried to write, to direct, to find new ways to matter. But the pain was always there, a reminder of every fight, every fall, every time he refused to quit. He wondered if it was worth it. He wondered if he should have stopped, if he should have let go, if he should have accepted that the world was done with him. But he didn't. He kept going. He kept showing up. He kept enduring, even when it hurt, even when it made no sense, even when quitting would have been easier. Because for Stallone, pain was the price of survival. And as long as he could move, as long as he could fight, as long as he could stand in front of a camera and refuse to disappear, he was still alive. The world saw the scars. He felt the cost, and the cost was everything. There's a myth that survival is about strength. For Stallone, it was about refusal. Refusal to quit, refusal to disappear, refusal to let the world have the last word. He was never the industry's favorite. He was never the critic's darling. He was never the obvious choice. He was the guy with the crooked mouth, the slurred voice, the body built from pain and stubbornness. He was the man who was told over and over that he didn't belong. And he stayed anyway. He watched the world change around him. He watched new faces rise and fall, watched trends come and go, watched the business that had once spit him out try to claim him as a legend. He didn't trust it. He didn't need it. He knew what it had cost him to survive. He carried the scars, physical, emotional, invisible. He carried the memory of sleeping in bus stations, of selling his dog, of being told to give up. He carried the humiliation, the hunger, the endless, grinding pressure to prove that he mattered. He carried the knowledge that, for most of his life, quitting would have made sense. But he didn't quit. He kept writing, kept acting, kept showing up. He kept enduring, even when the world stopped watching, even when the applause faded, even when the pain was the only thing that felt real. He kept going because he didn't know how to stop, because stopping would have meant admitting that the world was right about him. He became a symbol not of victory, but of survival, not of triumph, but of endurance. He became proof that sometimes the only thing you can do is refuse to disappear. He looked back on his life and saw the cost. He saw the years lost to pain, to rejection, to the endless fight to be seen. He saw the moments where everything could have ended quietly, where giving up would have been easier, cleaner, less painful. He He saw the faces of the people who had doubted him, the doors that had closed, the chances that had slipped away. But he also saw the moments where he refused, the moments where he stood up one more time and said, "I'm still here." Sylvester Stallone didn't win. He endured. And in the end, that was enough. Not because it made him a legend, but because it made him real. Because it made him human. Because it meant that, for all the pain, all the loss, all the humiliation, he had survived when quitting made sense. And that, in a world that erases people like him every day, is a legacy that matters.